Okay, hello, folks. I wanted to start this podcast off with a little summary of what I'm planning to discuss this time around. So, today's topic is really about when I'm thinking about starting to write a fiction story. I'm thinking about more more of a like, what is my feeling about this specific type of fiction that I'm writing? A fair amount of the fiction that I've worked on recently has been more in the sort of fantasy, sort of like Knights with Swords, um, that sort of area. The important thing is making sure that you start. I recall a while ago I read an interesting note that like Stephen King, the author who's like famous for all those horror novels, but that he had like some sort of, I don't know if he still does it, but it said that he had a sort of personal sort of policy or mentality of writing 2,500 words every single day. And that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Obviously that is a lot of words. So, I mean, I'm not talking, writing that much. I'm more saying making a habit of consistently writing every day is something that is just going to be a huge help towards your overall writing progress. But in terms of how I go about preparing to get started with writing a story, that's something that I would say, there's ways different people do that. What I generally do is I'll get like a Word document or I'll open up Scrivener. I like Scrivener in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of the sort of annoyances that Microsoft Word has. So one of the things that I find irritating about Word is that, and I'm sure you can turn them off and stuff, but I like for example, the predictive writing where, it'll kind of guess what you're trying to write and you could just press tab to have it write more of it. And while that is helpful when you're writing other stuff, such as, working on a resume or something like that, it is definitely not helpful when you're writing fantasy or science fiction, just because that's like an area where this large language model or LLM type of mentality, it it's kind of more detrimental than it is helpful, because what other writers have done is not necessarily something that you want to emulate yourself. Me specifically, I'm always trying to, y- y- you know, I want to write what is interesting to me, not just kind of parrot what other writers have said in the past, which is kind of what I feel LLM does. I definitely want to devote some podcast episodes to LLM in the future. So I definitely don't want to over talk about it right now. But when I'm first getting started, what I generally find is helpful is to, firstly, you've got to make your workspace conducive to writing. So if you have a workspace and you have, like, say, a bunch of cocktails and like, alcoholic beverages and stuff like that, y- and you have that right next to your computer, you're not going to get a lot of work done because you're going to be like, oh, I wonder if there's like cool puppy or cool kitten photo or like videos on YouTube or something like that. And then, you'll go down that rabbit hole. And after watching, kittens playing with balls of yarn and, puppies chasing after little, I don't know, tennis balls or something like that, for the next like 4 hours, you're going to be like, oh, I'm so tired. That's one example of something to definitely steer clear of. Another thing that I find, and this is another reason I'm a huge fan of Scrivener, is that Scrivener, by its very nature, it's more of it's like a plain interface. And by the way, when I'm talking about it, it's essentially like a word processing program that you can buy, and it's generally used by writers just because it has a lot of tools that writers find useful. And technically you can also use I forget what it's called at the moment, but it's like the sort of method of writing that's kind of like almost code, where you can like specify like specific fonts and stuff like that. I ended up deciding against using that just because I'm cool with, just having a normal word processor. But what you want is essentially a space, a workspace that will support you. For example, for me, I've, mostly cleared off my desk. But the important thing is I've kept my keyboard front and center on my desk. So, obviously that's the thing I would be writing with. And, other times I'll have, stuff piled up around my keyboard. But in preparation for writing, I always make sure that my keyboard is all on its own, just in the very center of the desk. And you want an environment which is going to help kind of get those creative juices flowing, so to speak. So I always make sure that my window, or at least the curtains, are drawn a little bit so that, yes, it's dark-ish, but you want to have some, rays of sunlight get inside, because you also really want to, you want there to be enough around you that makes you feel in like a cheerful or uplifted mood. And when I say, to avoid things like alcohol earlier, I also recommend avoiding things like drinking too much coffee, because when you're writing, it's very similar to, I would say, like a performance type of sport, or so like playing like basketball, or like something like singing, because you want to stay well hydrated, not too well hydrated, but you want to drink, just a bit of water, because what you want to do is you want to make sure that your brain has sufficient sort of power to get through a writing session. And you'll notice that up until this point in the podcast episode, I have not even mentioned starting to write. And the reason is that, at least for me, a huge part of writing comes down to, having the correct mentality, having the correct mindset in order to prepare to write. And some people, well, actually a lot of people, take this to an extreme, because I know a fair number of people who, getting back to what I mentioned in the first episode of the podcast, there's a lot of people I know who claim to be writers or to enjoy writing and have not written a single thing for the past like 5 years or something. And like, of course I'm being a little sarcastic there, because like, of course writers, generally can't stay away from writing for too long. But what I'm trying to get at here is that once you have your sort of setting for writing down, then you'll want to just sit down and get going. One other, I guess you could say, side note is that I would recommend avoiding listening to music while writing. Why do I say this? Because you can definitely write some really good, at least I can write really good fiction if I'm, listening to music. The problem is that the music will influence your writing. So recently I've been on a bit of a Shostakovich sort of thing recently. Shostakovich is a musician who was writing during the sort of Joseph Stalin time in Russia. And his music has this, it's been kind of described by people as being painful and sort of vaguely rebellious, while being just as bleak and gray as possible. I remember one particular comment I saw called his music Battleship Gray. And I find that so accurate. So when I'm writing while listening to something like Shostakovich, my writing in turn becomes more kind of like regimented. You kind of have the sense of like, the stormtroopers and Star Wars, and that's not really what you want to kind of get into a habit of when you're doing writing projects. I'm just like sitting here looking at my bookshelf, and there's so many different books on there that are very much, they're unique in their own way. And none of that is because when I say unique in their own way, what I'm trying to get at is consistently throughout those books, the author is writing in a specific tone. And his tone or her tone is not changing depending on what particular song they're listening to. So I would say that this is particularly relevant in the sense that what you want to do is, so I'll get like, I'll get like a blank Scrivener page or a blank Word document, and I'll just start writing. So I'll say like, I'll say like, okay, I want this to be a, regular length, as in like say 200-ish page or 250 page fiction book. And then I'll say, and this is also where I bring in Brandon Sanderson has a really interesting, he has a very interesting concept, which he says often some of the things which are more interesting than the magic itself is the limitations on the magic, like in your story. And I know for one, Brandon Sanderson has some really interesting magic in the books that he's written. And you'll hear about Brandon Sanderson a fair amount because I'm a huge fan of Brandon Sanderson. He's just a really gifted author. But so in the second part of the, I guess you could say, not so much outlining, but more outlining the sort of bones of the skeleton. I'm not a huge fan of detailed outlining, but what you do need is you need a skeleton for your book, because without a skeleton, it's going to be a invertebrate, And I know I'm kind of going off on a sort of biology tangent here, but like with an invertebrate, you're more looking at a story which uh, can kind of morph as you go. And that's that kind of like more freehand style writing. While it's fun and stuff, I certainly enjoy that kind of writing. It's not going to result in something that people will want to pick up and read, just because you need to have some sort of structure. So I'll say, like, what are the elements of, let's just choose fantasy. What are the elements of magic going to be like in this book? And that's one reason why I feel like Harry Potter was, it was just very unique in that the magic in Harry Potter seemed like it had no limits, which does not normally, that doesn't really work. So the fact that it worked in Harry Potter was, I don't know, that was like shocking. Just because, like, one would think that if you could just wave a wand and, conjure up whatever you want, really, it seemed too powerful. But you want to make definitions for what you're going to be working with. So let's just say, for example, that magic in your fictional landscape revolves around green lettuce. So everyone in the land has farms, and they're growing green lettuce. And each time they want to do a magical spell, they will pick a head of lettuce and, I don't know, say maybe they'll eat the lettuce. And while they're eating it, they're forming a magical spell in their mind. And once they've eaten the lettuce, all the power in the lettuce goes into their body, and they the magical spell is completed, and the amount of efficacy the spell has only lasts as long as I don't know, the energy from the lettuce that you've eaten just gave you. So that's obviously I had to think of that on the spot there. But you want to think of something that will limit your type of magic, because if you make things too powerful, then it's kind of like the king had a gigantic army, and one day he was annoyed by his army, so he waved his wizard staff, and the entire army fell dead on the ground. And the next day, a rival kingdom came towards him, and since he had no army, he just decided to wave his wizard staff, and the entire enemy army turned into chickens. And then he got hungry, so he waved his wizard staff again, and the entire enemy army turned into deep fried chickens. And then someone was like, that's kind of like a little weird and kind of cannibalistic. And he was like, so he waved his wizard staff, and the entire enemy army vanished, and there was like a bunch of tables that were covered with good food or something. So that's an example of the kind of magic which that would just like, imagine reading a story that has magic like that in it. You would be like, this is pretty darn dumb, because there's no kind of like quest to get the gold at the end of the quest. There's no, there's no drama. There's no intrigue or anything throughout that story. So that's like one example of what I'm talking about. You also, in your outlining for the upcoming story, you want to do it, very, very broad sort of overview of what you're going to do. So like, say the prince, it's like a coming of age story. The prince comes of age, or is going to come of age soon. Or maybe he's not even a prince, just like whatever. This mysterious stranger comes into town and convinces this guy to follow him as his apprentice, and they leave the town. And as they journey through the woods, they hear of some, I don't know, dragon that is keeping watch over some princess or something like that. And, at the end of the story, the guy and the girl get married, and, something like that. But what that does is it gives your story a bit of structure. So you have a story which will ultimately result in the hero of your story getting married, and you have a magic system based on lettuce. And so there's like constraints to magic, and you have, a lot of stuff can happen along the path, but as far as you go, like, it's not like you're going to be kind of wondering what else can be done with magic, because, for magic to exist, you need the sun, because you need to grow the darn lettuces. And so there's a bit of a structure in that sense. Another thing that you've got to kind of also deal with is, I recall a while ago there was this really funny, what was it called? The Fantasy Writers Checklist or something, where it was basically like, basically it was just like a parody checklist about all the ways that fantasy writers try to make their story seem original, but it ends up looking kind of like a sort of a snobby or a snobbish high class sort of copycat version of the Lord of the Rings. So like basically people need to have character names which are all 10 characters or longer. So like Mon Chutalak or something like would be like the name of one person, and then you have like Valsharin or Valsharina, like just making up all these kind of like random names. And then that to a certain extent, while that does work for some people like Tolstoy, because if you've ever read Tolstoy, you're going to know that like the people in those stories have these crazy names. But on the other hand, in that time, that's kind of more names people have. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, just go simple. So one thing that I will do is I'll just write down like the main character names, like Bob, Peter, John, Mary, Susan. Just give them normal names. You can always substitute the names out later, just like have like a, Control F and like, find and replace all the names in the story. But you don't want to do that to yourself. Like, if possible, the names should complement the story. They should not be part of the story. Like, you want your story to be a compelling thing for people to read. You don't want people to be constantly kind of like, so what was that Sharina person's name? And what was the other one? Like, I mean, I've already forgotten that. But if you just name people normal stuff, that's best. And then also you're going to want to, well, I mean, so getting back to Brandon Sanderson, another thing you'll want to do is he says, obviously constraints have more interest than just like the magic itself. But he says, at the end of the day, if something seems really cool and you think that would be really interesting, go for it. And I absolutely agree with that, because especially when it comes to magic or the kind of supernatural or whatever, it really does come down to, if it is cool enough, you'll find it to be very intriguing. And I know, for instance, I was a huge fan of the Robert Jackson Bennett series about the Lochlands, Shorefell, Foundryside, etc., because like it had a very unique approach to writing. Well, because you write magic on these like sigils that are kind of on, plates, and then you use that to power sort of computers in a sort of pseudo electronic magic system. It was just very, very unique magic. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, there's no way that kind of thing can actually work. So it is magic, but it's cool, and it also had and I'm not going to spoil this, but like if you end up reading it, you'll see it has a very, very unique limit on how the magic comes about. But I'm obviously not going to spoil that one. So I guess what I'm trying to get at, I know we're getting towards the end of the episode 2 of the podcast here, but what I think really what it comes down to when you're working on preparing for a writing project, especially one of science fiction, one of fantasy, although in a much broader sense, it is very much any type of fiction that you write. You want to think of it in terms of the skeleton of the story, not like an outline, not like in pages 1 to 10, the hero wakes up and gets dressed and goes, has breakfast, etc., blah, blah, blah. You don't want it to be like that. You want it to be more like main character, Bob, a boy of, say, 18, who in their age, people come of age at age 19. And he is currently a blacksmith apprentice. And he's like very strong because of that. And this very ancient woman comes into town, and he's like, I don't know, they're like all going to this local pub, and the woman has an arm wrestling contest with him and beats him like within seconds. And he's like, wow, that's so impressive. And she's like, yeah, follow me as part of like the storyline, and I'll train you in this amazing new method of strength. and he discovers that. So that's what I'm talking about. So like, build a sort of picture of your main characters. Or you could, like, what I generally do is I will do like a 1 paragraph long sort of kind of like paragraph about my main character, sort of like that mini story that I just shared there. Kind of like try to draw a picture of who your character is using words. And often that will be more helpful than saying like, 5'8" tall, 200 pounds heavy, blue eyes, brown hair. Like, if you go too crazy into the details there, it's going to start feeling, and I've done that before, where you go crazy on the details and then you're like, oh, this is such a chore. And you have to kind of be constantly switching back and forth between your list of the character attributes and the actual story. And ultimately it becomes such a, just like a task to write your story that you just kind of fizzle off and you're like, okay, this is not fun. This is just kind of drudgery. Like you want your writing to be something that you find enjoyable. And for me, the reason I find it enjoyable is because I allow myself to give my creativity a vibrant outlet. So I'll use my computer, obviously, as a place to store the story, but ultimately what I'm doing is I'm giving my, oh, my cat just jumped on the table here. No, okay. But you want to give yourself a creative outlet. And if you've defined too much stuff, you won't be able to do that. And so that's why I'm saying, like, define like the really key things, and also give constraints to things like, say, magic. And also, for example, like with technology, is it a time where people are using swords, or do they have guns? And if they have guns, what kind of guns do they have? And do they still have the technology to manufacture them? And, so like, I think a good example of something that I found to be very amusing back in the day was there was this picture book by this British author for kids called Graham Oakley. And he normally wrote the Church Mice books, but he also wrote one called Henry's Quest, which is about this guy who goes through this sort of magical sort of world in a post-apocalyptic sort of setting in hunt of this fearsome creature called gasoline, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's gas, because he put it in a motorcycle. And the point I'm trying to get at here is this world, like, are the things that are being used, is it something that is still being manufactured? So, like, let's say people have swords. Can they still manufacture swords? Or is the supply of swords limited by what has already been made? So, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, for me, writing really does come down to, firstly, preparing to write. Get your writing setting done, have your writing setting there. Because if you're not mentally preparing yourself to write, then you're never really going to be able to start writing. And even if you do, your writing will suffer. Secondly, use some, I guess, common sense limits on the sort of the magical flying carpets in your story. Because if you give magic too much magic, that'll just make the story uninteresting. Think of ways that you can put unique limits on magic. Then also, what you're going to want to do is you'll want to make that sort of skeleton of the story. Don't give yourself too many guardrails, but give yourself some guardrails. So, like, if your story is about a human, like a boy, like 18 years old guy, if it's about that, like, you're not going to have him like be a genius when it comes to sword fighting, unless, obviously he grew up as a prince with tons of sword mentors or something. If the hero of your story is a 12-year-old guy, well, then he's not going to be the super buff, guy who can lift like 500 pounds or, something like that. You'll want to put some very general sort of definitions in, but I guess what you want to do is just put enough in so that your story will have somewhere it's going, have a very broad overview of what's going to be in it, but give yourself the opportunity to just write some fiction. Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's fiction or science fiction or, I don't know, historical fiction or something like that. And writing is fun. It should be fun. I know the Beatles have that song about paperback writer, but I feel like even in that song, they have to be poking fun at it in a certain sense, because you don't make money if you go into writing for the wrong reasons. If you go into writing because you want to make lots of money, you're not going to make lots of money. What people are drawn to is writing which is compelling because it tells a different story than everything else out there. And it does it in a way that is interesting. And that's to a huge extent why I think that this whole kind of craze over large language models / AI that's a non-issue for writers, because people aren't going to be interested in recycled or just kind of like modified tropes. And only humans have the ability to, at least so far, take like all this, all the history of humanity's time and blend all of that into a unique new story. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that is a very uplifting thing. It's good to know that writers are not going to be going out of business anytime soon, but it's not really a business either. Writing should be something that you find enjoyment or pleasure in. Writing should be something that you want to do. And because of that, when you write, it should be something that you should be writing because you want to. And going back to the start of this podcast episode here, when you write, it should be something that you should have that be the focus of your writing session. And I know for me, when I have this little ritual where I'll do writing every single morning, and that's it's my time to do my writing, and that's what you want to get going. You want to get a little routine going so that in the future you'll like wake up one day and you'll be like, wow, I can't believe that I've got this routine going where I write. And next thing you know, maybe you won't necessarily be the next big famous writer, but you'll have a large amount of writing that has been accomplished. And I guess as a kind of postscript or like, the PS sort of for this podcast episode, I want to say is don't stop reading books. Don't stop, for me, listening to audiobooks, because one of the best resources that you have for new content for your own writing is writing other people have done. I know I get great inspiration out of stories that I'm currently reading. For instance, right now I'm working through Death Masks by Jim Butcher, which is kind of like a fiction detective thing with magic in it. You want to just be constantly reading. And if you, say, subscribe to all the latest author news and kind of writing stuff, that's good. I personally don't really do that. I more research what I need to research and use that to support and to bolster and complement my writing. But I do, to a very good extent, try to steer clear of things that guide or support actual writing. And basically, I'm just trying to preserve the integrity of what I'm writing about. Anyways, though, folks, if you did make it this far in the podcast episode, very much appreciated. Make sure to like my podcast, subscribe to it. I definitely plan on keeping it going strongly. I plan on releasing at minimum at least one podcast episode every week. Ideally, I'm going to be putting out more, but thank you again to those who have joined me for podcast episode number 2. Thank you all, and this is Patrick Devlin, your podcast host. Bye for now.